We're going to have our discussion panel now for the age of the earth. Pastor David, can I trouble you for some... Wow, he read my mind. Did you see that? That's amazing. We're going to call up our guest speakers here. Come on down. Come on down. You are the next contestants on the age of the earth. And just so you know the format, Dr. Zuckerin's got a couple of pre-arranged questions that they're going to start doing from the front, and then that's going to be about maybe it's going to be they're actually the heavy-hitting questions that they're going to cover, and then after they finish those questions, we're going to shift format to a little more of I'm going to run around the room, get some exercise, do the roving mic thing. So if some of you have questions that they didn't answer, then we'll take your questions too, and then we'll put them on the spot. Dun, 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 dun. And then after that, we'll take a quick 5-minute break before we head to our, that's right, workshops. So, but before that, we're going to also want to just call to your mind, if you really appreciate what we're doing here at Evidence and Answers, they do a number of different things during the year, podcasts and conferences and opportunities to reach out and share. We're going to give you an opportunity. We're going to kind of walk you through what it's like to think about supporting Evidence and Answers financially, but we'll tell you a bit more about that later. So, Dr. Zukrin, can I go ahead and pass it on to you just to go ahead and lead us off for our Age of the Earth panel discussion?
All right, thank you, James. Yes, as you have noticed last night, our speakers have two different positions regarding the age of the Earth, and so we're going to have a dialogue on that issue that, often it's a debate that has been going on for quite a while. So let's begin with you, Dr. Ross. First, explain to us briefly your position. It's called Old Earth Creationism. Briefly explain that one to us.
Yes, I mean, it's the idea that the days of creation in Genesis chapter 1, rather than being 6 consecutive 24-hour periods, are 6 consecutive long periods of time. It's a position where we believe that Adam and Eve were specially created by God relatively recently. So I think we all agree that Adam and Eve are specially created and recently created. I mean, it's the last creation miracle that God had performed. So it's not an issue over Adam and Eve, nor is it an issue over evolution. I think we all agree that naturalistic evolution can happen under a young Earth scenario or an old Earth scenario.
Okay. Oh, by the way, I forgot. I need to introduce the panel. Dr. Hugh Ross, with Reasons to Believe, represents the Old Earth Creationist position. We have Dr. Evan Kawamura. He has his PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Hawaii. He also works with NASA. So he'll be representing the young Earth position. So it's easy to remember, right? Young guy, young Earth, old guy. Does physical age have anything to do with your position on the age of the Earth?
No, I was old Earth when I was young, too.
Okay. But then we have Dr. Richard Howe. Richard, you're an old guy, but you hold to the young Earth position. Shouldn't you be here?
Well, I know it's at least 67 years old, the Earth is, although I think the first few years I have on hearsay. So.
Okay. All right, so that's our panel here. All right. Also, Dr. Ross, as an old Earth creationist, you believe in a literal Adam and Eve and a fall and a Garden of Eden and all that.
Right.
Okay. Now, is old Earth creation position just another form of what's known as theistic evolution? Is there a difference here?
There's a major difference. In fact, our Reasons to Believe scholar team did a 2 views book with Biologos. That's a Christian team that holds to a theistic evolution position. Theistic evolution is the position that God worked through mutations, natural selection, gene exchange, and epigenetics to produce the life we see here on Earth. He basically worked through the naturalistic processes, whereas we hold the position that yes, these processes do operate, but they don't produce much. And so the fossil record, the history of life on planet Earth, is predominantly explained by divine, miraculous interventions, and many of them.
Yes, and is there a danger, some people are asking, that if you take the old Earth creationist position, is there a danger, a slippery slope that you'd be sliding into Darwinism?
Well, I think it's fundamentally based on most young earth creationists believe that when God said what he created was very good, that meant there was no death at all. And so the fact that the old earth position has plants and animals dying before Adam sinned, they see that as counter to what Genesis 1 is teaching. They say that can't be very good. And on that basis, they would say, well, we're going to need to have the herbivores rapidly evolve into carnivores at the fall of Adam. And they also hold to, I think it's important to realize, the young earth position came out of a global flood model. So the global flood interpretation gave rise to young earth creationism. It's not the other way around. And with the flood, there's a limited number of animals you can have on board the ark. So they claim that the few thousand species on board the ark rapidly evolved into the millions we have on the planet today. And so a core feature of young earth creationism is a belief that this naturalistic evolution happens very rapidly and very efficiently, whereas old earth creationists take the position it's not rapid, it's not efficient. It may be capable of producing some new species, depending on how you define a species, but you're not going to get new classes. You're not going to get new families or orders or phyla through those mechanisms. And interestingly, atheist paleontologists now admit that if it's naturalistic evolution, you get a proliferation of species, and if you wait a long time, you get new genera. Wait much longer time, you get new families. The problem is, you look at the fossil record, you see the exact opposite. The phyla show up first, then the classes, then the orders. Last of all, you get the proliferation of species. And as James Valentine has written in peer-reviewed literature, this is the exact opposite of what you'd expect from a materialistic or naturalistic interpretation.
Yes, well, let's move to the young earth side now. Dr. Howe, so when we're talking young earth creationism position, how old do we say the earth and the universe is?
Well, as I said, at least 67 years old. Got that in, all right, got my joke in. I think the range is anywhere from about 6,000 if you go to Bishop Ussher to somewhere around 10,000 that I've heard as an outside limit from Old Testament young earth creationists. So it's probably somewhere within that spectrum.
Yes, now, Richard, what is at the heart of the debate here? Some people say that this is an inerrancy issue, or you giving up the inspiration of the Bible if you hold to a position like what Dr. Ross holds. Is that the issue here?
This is probably the most important thing to me that we communicate at this conference, that I think that it's not that. And so in that respect, I'm different from every other young earther that I know, except the ones that at the seminary. There are a few at our seminary, Southern Evangelical. In other words, while I may disagree with Dr. Ross in terms of how we interpret the days of Genesis or these kinds of things, in my perspective as a young earther, it's a matter of just how do we understand both the science and the scriptures. But in this case, we're talking about the scriptures. So that I am very comfortable and actually go to the mat to defend Dr. Ross's fealty and commitment to the inerrancy and authority of the scriptures. And so it's a family dispute over the interpretation of Genesis. And the reason I emphasize that is I came to realize how much animus there was in this debate, where some leadership in the young earth community, which in many respects I would identify with in terms of their conclusions, were nevertheless characterizing the old earth position as if somehow they were compromising the authority of the Bible. And I go, I could understand perhaps examples of things that someone who professes to be a Christian, an example of something, some position they take, that I might say, well, you just don't believe the Bible. Like, for example, if somebody said, well, I'm a Christian, I believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, I just don't believe Jesus ever existed. You just go, okay, well, that's just crazy. I mean, you might disagree with a lot of things, but if you say you believe the Bible, you can't just say that Jesus never existed. It obviously taught that Jesus existed. So what would be a better position if you thought Jesus didn't exist is just to say, I think the Bible is just wrong, all right? But obviously not everything's that way. So there's lots of disputes that have peppered church history where even though they can get enthusiastic, in the debate, we nevertheless acknowledge the other side of the debate as still being within the family of God. like say the Calvinist-Arminian debate. Okay, so I had a brother who was a 5-point Dortian Calvinist Presbyterian pastor, but he would never have characterized an Amyraldian or an Arminian or any of those non-Calvinists. He would have never characterized them as, well, they just don't believe the Bible, or they just are compromisers or things. They might say, well, they're not very good, Bible interpreters, and that's part of the debate. So that's how I would like to see this debate move towards, especially in the U.S., is that one last thing I know, I told the audience last night that I'm thinking about starting a blog called More Than You Wanted to Know, because I'm telling you more than you wanted to know. But I regret that the leadership of a lot of the young earth community with whom I'm familiar, they've created a ghetto. So they're a community of Christians who are talking to each other, and I think they misinterpret the echo they're hearing as being formative in their arguments. In other words, well, we've really got a good case because everybody around them is affirming the same conclusions. And so they've insulated themselves in some strategic ways from the rest of the body of Christ to have a robust debate. And I know this from personal experience because we have the longest running and largest apologetics conference in the U.S. done through Southern Evangelical Seminary. And I can tell you how hard it has been. I don't organize the debate, but I'm there as a faculty with the staff that are putting the debate together, how hard it's been to get young earth creationists to come to an apologetics conference and make their case, because they almost feel like what I would imagine a Christian would feel like if they were asked to go to a Mormon conference. If you were invited to a Mormon conference, say, hey, would you be willing to come give your position? You'd happily do that. Say, I'd love to give you my position as an evangelical in contradistinction to Mormonism. But while you were at the Mormon conference, you would know, I'm not really part of this. That's the way they acted. I actually asked one of them, I said, you act almost like we're a cult, and that you're not really part of this family. And he kind of laughed and accepted that characterization. Well, I regret that, because I think if there's ever going to be any advance in this that's productive, that doesn't detract from the glory of God, we've got to figure out some way to get rid of the animus and the mischaracterization. Well, these people are compromisers. I was actually called the compromiser by one of these leaders. So it's like, wait a minute, I'm a young earther. How could I be a compromiser in that regard? Anyway, that's more than you wanted to know.
Yeah, and so how did, we heard last night how Dr. Ross came to his position. How did you come to your position that the earth is young?
So to me, initially, it was more or less just a default in terms of how I understood Genesis. That was one thing, just taking it prima facie. Day one, morning, evening, that just sounded like regular days. But then as I was growing a little bit, and I was saved as a pin-headed teenager at 16, so you have to sort of interpret it in that context as to how much I could really process some of this stuff. But for better or for worse, my initial introduction to the scientific debate regarding creation was Young Earth Material, Institute of Creation Research, Henry Morris, for example, which, by the way, back to your point about inerrancy, Henry Morris signed the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy Chicago Statement, which is the definitive document sort of circumscribing how evangelicals, broadly speaking, have understood the doctrine of inerrancy. And even though Henry wouldn't sign a more attenuated statement regarding science over the days of the Genesis, he did sign the overall statement on inerrancy because he understood the doctrine of inerrancy is broad enough to allow these different interpretations of Genesis. So it was the combination of a prima facie reading of Genesis plus my first inaugural experiences with Institute of Creation Research and Henry Morris.
Now, Evan, you're the young earth scientist here. Some people have trouble with the scientific evidence and holding to a young earth position. So can you give us scientific evidence for a young earth?
Yes, I thought you'd never ask. So I brought some notes with me. So as Dr. Howe mentioned, Institute for Creation Research, here are 5 global evidences for young earth. So you can look at continental erosion. It happens a lot quicker than we thought. Another one is ocean salt accumulation. So there's a lot of salt in the ocean. It builds up very rapidly. And if you kind of go back in time, the oceans could be at least or at most 62 million years old. That's how they come up with that idea. And then if you look at Earth's magnetic field, that would be the third one. It's decaying. The Earth is losing electrical current, so the magnetic field gets weaker over time. They say that we know Earth's magnetic field is losing 50% of its energy every 1,400 years or so. And so therefore, the Earth's magnetic field could be only 12 or 20,000 years old at most. And so since we have a decaying electrical current within Earth's core, it could maintain a magnetic field for 6,000 years or so, which is very reasonable and fits, as Dr. Howe mentioned, Usher's calendar. The fourth one is surviving radiocarbon in old specimens. So you heard of like carbon dating. So radioactive carbon decay occurs so quickly that even the most sensitive scientific instrument shouldn't be able to detect any radiocarbon in a sample even 100,000 years old. Yet, ironically, we see tons of radiocarbon in coal, oil, natural gas, and dinosaur bones, which have been dated to be millions of years old. So there might be something going on over there. They also find radiocarbon in diamonds, which are supposedly billions of years old. But again, how can you detect this accurately in a sample that's even 100,000 years old? And then finally, the fifth point they mentioned is helium in old zircons. It sounds like it's from Star Trek or something. But what happens is you have these zircon crystals, and it has helium and lead inside, and they decay radioactively. And so you can look at the rate of how the lead decays or how fast the helium decays. And let me jump down a little bit. So they look at something called the leakage rate. The more scientific term is called diffusivity, which is like if you take a balloon, it's going to lose some of the helium. So eventually, if you suck it in, your voice isn't going to sound funny. So you can do something similar for these zircon crystals. You can look at how the lead leaks out of the crystals or how the helium leaks out the crystals. So you have two different metals you can look at. And so if you look at just the lead one, you're going to say that the zircon crystals are about billions of years old. But if you look at the helium, you would say the zircon crystals are only thousands of years old. So you get a very, very different measurement and time there. So it depends on what you want to look at. But either way, we find evidence of accelerated nuclear decay. So in summary, again, if you're taking notes, the 5 are continental erosion is faster than we thought. The second one is ocean salt accumulation. The third is Earth's decaying magnetic field. Fourth is radiocarbon in old specimens. And then the last one is the helium in old zircons.
Yes. Well, Hugh, you state that the universe is billions of years old. What scientific evidence do we have that we know it's that old?
Oh, I think I need the opportunity to respond to your 5, if that's acceptable.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at radiocarbon, you do see them in diamonds, you do see them in zircons, you see them in things that measure to be billions of years old, for the simple reason that Earth's crust is filled with uranium and thorium and nitrogen. And so like in the atmosphere, you get cosmic rays coming through that convert the nitrogen into carbon-14. That also happens in the crust of the Earth, not because of cosmic rays, but because of the residual uranium and thorium. These are radioisotopes. And so that's the energy source that converts. And this is going to keep going on and on and on. So you're going to get a residual level. And what's interesting, when you look at the diamonds and the zircons, anything that measures to be really old, you get what's called a baseline carbon-14 date of about 58,000 years. And radiocarbon has a half-life of 5,715 years. And so you get a reliable date within a factor of 7. 1/7 to 7 times is where you're going to get a reliable date. The 58,000 is outside that range, but the 58,000 is exactly what you'd expect given the amount of uranium and thorium and nitrogen in the crust of the Earth. And so whenever we scientists see something that's 58,000 years by carbon-14, we say that's just the background level. Everything's going to measure to be 58,000 years, given that it's sufficiently old. So it's an indication that it's old. The magnetic field, young Earth creationists presume that Earth's magnetic field is declining in a linear fashion. That's not the case. It's sinusoidal. And right now it is going down. In the future, it will go up. In the past, it's been going up. So it sinusoidally varies. between about 1/10 of a Gauss and about 8/10 of a Gauss. And this has been going on throughout the whole history of the Earth. It's well understood by our understanding of Earth having a solid core of nickel and iron and cobalt and a surrounding liquid core. And we actually predict that there will be these random reversals. So every few thousand to every 100,000, several 100,000 years, the Earth's magnetic field flips like this. And that is when you do get a flipping over, you go from a dipole to a multipole. And right now we're heading down towards a multipole level. So we anticipate our magnetic field will decline down to about 1/10 of a Gauss. And then you get a polar reversal, and it goes back up to 8/10 of a Gauss. So that's 2 of your 5. What was on one of the other ones?
Ocean salt accumulation.
Ocean salt accumulation. There again is the assumption that the salt accumulates in a linear fashion. There are salt mines in the continental U.S. And so what's happening is that you get these salt lakes or salt seas, and they get trapped by landmass, evaporates, and you get a salt deposit. It's the plate tectonics that recycles that salt. So if you look over the long-term history of the Earth, the total salt content is constant, but it shifts locations. The rivers wash off the land masses. They take the salt that's there and put it in the ocean, but different parts of the ocean get isolated, and you get a salt concentration. But it's plate tectonics that explains why that salt gets recycled from the land mass to the ocean, from the ocean back to the land mass. That's been going on. And what was the 4th one?
Continental erosion.
Continental erosion. Continental erosion varies over the course of the Earth, and the argument from the young Earth position is that if you look at continental erosion, that eventually would cause all the mountains and land masses to be reduced to a level barely above sea level. But what they're not taking into account is volcanoes and plate tectonic activity. So here in Hawaii, these are volcanic islands. And what you see here in Hawaii, by the way, the state of Hawaii is unique amongst the 50 states of the Union in that it's the one state that's getting bigger and bigger as time goes on. Why? Because the volcanic activity that's producing new land masses is greater than the erosion rate.
That's good news for H1, I think.
It's good news for H1, it's bad news for Kauai, because in Kauai, volcanism has stopped, and you've got quite aggressive erosion, and Kauai is getting smaller and smaller, but the big island's getting bigger and bigger. So the total land area of Hawaii is actually increasing in spite of what's happening here on Oahu. Oahu's getting smaller too. So you might want to invest in land here because it's going to get more and more deer as the land masses disappear. And so there again, we need to take into account that it's not just erosion, there's plate tectonics, there's volcanism, and actually what you see over the course of the Earth is something that I mentioned in my talk on Thursday night, is that actually the buildup of land masses is slightly greater than the erosion rate. Right now, 29% of planet Earth is covered by continents and islands. In the future, it'll rise to 30%. So the buildup of land masses is actually slightly greater than the decay rate as a result of erosion. What was number 5?
Helium in old zircons.
Oh yeah, helium. Okay, I've worked with helium as a physicist. It's the slipperiest of all the elements in the periodic table. You just can't contain it. Lead, on the other hand, is really heavy and very stable. And so no physicist would ever use the quantity of helium in any sample as an age indicator. It just slips around, moves in and out so easily. The lead, however, is stable. It's not going to be moving. And so how we date samples is that you've got uranium-238, uranium-235, thorium-232, and they decay into 3 different isotopes of lead. So uranium-232 decays into lead-208, uranium-235 into 207. From his thorium, that makes 208. Uranium-235, 207. Uranium-238 makes 206. So what physicists do is they will take a sample, they ignore the helium because that just moves in and out so easily that it's a useless dating tool, and they look at the 3 isotopes of lead, the thorium-232, uranium-235, uranium-238, and they wind up with 6 independent radiometric tools to date the sample. And we know we're dealing with a pure sample if all 6 methods give the identical age. And it's through this technique that physicists have been able to date the Earth with high precision. Using those 6 methods, we get a date for the age of the Earth, 4.5662 billion years, plus or minus 0.0001 billion. We actually have it nailed down to 5 places of the decimal. Now, one gas we can use to get a rough estimate of age is argon. Unlike helium, argon is heavy. It also is a little bit slippery, but nothing like helium. And so, for example, you've got potassium on the moon that's decaying into argon. Potassium-40 decays into argon. And so, on the moon, we say it has no atmosphere. Not true. It's got a thin argon atmosphere. And by measuring, and the argon comes 100% from potassium decay. So by looking at the quantity of argon in the atmosphere of the moon, we can date the moon, and the moon's age comes in at 4.45 billion, which is what caused astronomers to recognize the moon is slightly younger than the Earth. There must have been an event whereby the moon formed after the Earth. I've got a couple of chapters on that in some of my books. 2 planets. Our solar system began with 5 rocky planets. 2 of them collided with one another when the Earth was about 90 million years old, and that led to the formation of the moon and the argon quantity of the moon. And by the way, Earth's atmosphere is 1% argon. All of that argon came from potassium decay, and the amount of argon in our atmosphere is consistent with the Earth being 4.5662 billion years. What I'd like to say is that the Bible, what you'll see, you mentioned the Institute of Creation Research. Their most definitive scientific defense of a young Earth was the rate study. 2 volumes. I own the 2 volumes. They're big, thick books. But in those books, they repeatedly make the concession that if there is no radiometric variation in the radiometric decay rates, if the laws of physics never change, then the Earth and the universe must be billions of years old. And what I find interesting about that is the Bible repeatedly tells us that there's been no change in the laws of physics. So the leading scientists at the Institute of Creation Research and at Answers of Genesis are in public written record that if the laws of physics don't change, the Earth and the universe must be billions of years old. And the Bible explicitly tells us there's been no change in the laws of physics. There will be no change, Romans 8:23, until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem have in fact been redeemed. I'll be speaking about that later today, is that once that full number has been reached, God no longer needs the laws of physics. Those laws of physics are in place to eradicate evil. And when evil is eradicated, God's going to replace this universe with its laws of physics with brand new laws. But as long as evil is here, the laws of physics must remain constant. And the laws of physics are constant. The Earth and the universe must be billions of years old from the very writings of young Earth creationists as scientists. As an astronomer, I can tell you that our measurements tell us there's been no change in the laws of physics. So, for example, when we measure the spectra of the sun, that tells us what the laws of physics were 8 minutes ago, because it took the light 8 minutes to reach our telescopes. And so we measure the laws of physics right now and 8 minutes ago. We can do that with the Andromeda Galaxy. We can do that with the Large Magellanic Cloud. With the Large Magellanic Cloud, we're measuring the laws of physics 163,000 years ago, because that's how long it took the light to reach our telescope. Bottom line is this: all the stars and galaxies we observe all the way out to 13 billion light years, tell us that the laws of physics have not changed. Matter of fact, they tell us that the laws of physics have not changed by any degree greater than 1 part in 10 to the 18th per year. So with extremely high precision, we astronomers and physicists can confirm that the Bible got it right. Thousands of years ago, the Bible said no change in the laws of physics. Our measurements of stars and galaxies tell us the Bible got it right. And that's kind of a core feature of Reasons to Believe, is that we look at the scientific literature and discoveries and say, okay, does this demonstrate that the Bible has predictive power? And it does it in spades. Thousands of years ago, the Bible predicted hundreds of future scientific discoveries. And that was a huge factor in my coming to faith in Christ, realizing the Bible got all the history right, it got all the science right, it predicted future historical events, it predicted future scientific discoveries, and never made a mistake. That means it couldn't have come from a human being. It must have come from the one that actually did the deed.
Yes, so how do we account for, it looks like the universe is pretty old. How do we account for that from the young Earth perspective?
Who are you asking?
Either one.
Well, first of all, if you get nothing else out of this, we learned the word sinusoidally. I just think that's a cool word. Yeah, I'm going to add that to my...
That's basic trigonometry. You
Well,
got that in high school, right?
I wasn't there the day they taught trigonometry in trigonometry class, so I missed that. So another tendency I have as a young earther is more and more, especially over the past few years, to be willing to grant. Now, Evan may disagree with me about this, but this may be an expression more that he's trained scientifically. I'm a philosopher, which that may excuse a lot of things. By the way, I was going to ask you when you were talking about the decay of this element into that element, whether that was going to be on the test later. I didn't know whether. So like, do I need to know this? But the tendency that I've been trending towards the past few years, and again, this would make me sort of outside the kind of consensus of young Earth creationists with whom I'm familiar, is that perhaps it is the case that the science does say that the universe is old. And so you go, okay, well, if the science does seem to indicate that, sort of like what your reference to the ICR material, then why would one opt for a young Earth creationism? And two things. One, it's a matter of me being more comfortable with how I understand the Bible than being comfortable with how I understand or don't understand the science. So unless I could be comfortable with a principle of hermeneutics that would allow me to comfortably embrace an old earth given how I understand genealogies and then the days of Genesis, unless I could be comfortable with a hermeneutic that lets me do that, then I would opt for a young earth, even acknowledging that the science seems to go against that. The second thing is, then I think it would be analogous to how Christians must have been behaving however many hundreds of years ago, let's say 150, where the consensus among many scientists, and Dr. Ross can correct me if I've got a wrong characterization of the science that long ago, that the universe was eternal, sort of steady state. So what did Christians do when the science seemed to indicate the universe was eternal, or at least the scientists seemed to indicate that? Yet, I think most Christians probably felt like, well, it doesn't seem like the Bible says that. So of the two, I'm just going to bite the bullet and go, the scientists, I can't just answer their arguments, but I'm more comfortable with how I understand the scriptures than how I understand the science, and just leave it at that. And then, of course, I would leave it at that. I wouldn't want it to be left at that among the scientists. They can debate any more than I would want it to be left at that among the Hebrew scholars. So my brother, Tom Howe, Dr. Tom Howe at Southern Evangelical Seminary, is our professor of Hebrew and Old Testament. He wrote, but he didn't write it for public consumption, so I just texted him and said, hey, can I make this available? He wrote a response to Dr. Ross's exegesis of the Genesis narrative regarding the days as a Hebrew scholar. And I know Dr. Ross knows Hebrew as well. And so I asked Tom if he would let me basically make this available. So I'm going to put it on the page. We'll call it the page. of the website. Thomas Aquinas used to call Aristotle the philosopher. So I call my website the website, among all the other out there. And I created a page for this conference where I've have put some material, and I'll put that up. I'll show you at the beginning of my talk how to access that. And then my apologies to you. I haven't given it to you in advance because I just found out from him this morning that I could disseminate it more or less publicly. So I'll make that available, and perhaps Dr. Ross can write a response, and I'd put that on the page. And that's the kind of stuff that needs to happen, both among the Bible and language scholars on the one hand and the scientists on the other, and such. And then you'll see where the philosopher fits into this thing when I give my talk a little bit later on. So it's a matter of just where I'm more comfortable and how I understand the Bible. And I think as a matter of principle, Dr. Ross would celebrate that. Go, look, I wouldn't want you to violate your conscience. If you thought the Bible didn't say what Hugh Ross says it does, then go with your conscience in that regard, but be open to hear the arguments. What's the evidence and what's the arguments? And be willing to be persuaded that, okay, the weight of the evidence has convinced me that I misunderstood my Bible. I mean, after all, before the 17th century, not only all the scientists, but basically all the theologians believed that the earth was stationary with respect to the sun, and the sun was moving across the sky. And when Bellarmine wrote against Galileo and Copernicus, Bellarmine gave what I thought was a knockdown, drag-out argument for the fact that the earth is still and the sun is moving. And it was his quote from the Joshua 10, when Joshua commanded the sun to stand still. And Bellarmine, in writing, he didn't have a face-to-face with Galileo, said, well, you can't command something to stand still if it's not moving. So obviously the sun is moving, so obviously the Bible teaches the sun is moving. Galileo had an interesting response that wasn't public. He wrote to the Duchess Christina as to why taking that literal Joshua 10 really was a problem for both Ptolemy and Aristotle on one hand, and Copernicus and Galileo on the other. Everybody had a problem with that verse of Joshua chapter 10. Well, what did we do? It took several centuries, and it basically took the mathematicians to push it across the finish line, that we did with that verse in chapter 10 of Joshua exactly what we were already doing with the verse out of chapter 2 of Joel. When Joel says that the moon will turn to blood, nobody that I know ever thought the moon was literally going to become liquid with plasma and corpuscles and things like that. How did they interpret the Joel 2 passage? They interpreted it as language of appearance, phenomenological language. That a full eclipse of the moon turns blood red. So when Joel says the moon will turn will turn to blood, it meant it will turn red like blood. So eventually, all the Christians, except Robert Sungenis, I think is the only one that doesn't do this, took that passage then in Joshua 10 to be the language of appearance. That the sun obviously has the appearance of moving, but it's not with respect to the earth, but it's not literally moving and orbiting the earth, even though it seems to appear that way. It's just appearing to do that. So the language now of appearance is how we use hermeneutically to interpret Joshua chapter 10. So in other words, the principle of hermeneutics that were employed to reinterpret Joshua 10 was a principle already being employed in other scriptures. We just didn't realize, well, it needs to go here like it goes there. That principle then is sort of the boundaries under which I think we have to work to say, are there hermeneutical principles that we can comfortably come to a certain interpretation of a verse? Does the language of the Hebrew support a day-age theory or a framework theory or a literal 24-hour day or not? And here's the evidence, here's the arguments, and then you come to a settled conclusion and don't violate your conscience.
But you know, Richard, I think you're pointing out a key difference between young earth creationists and old earth creationists, and that's point of view. And as Galileo has said, you know, a big mistake you can make is get the wrong point of view.
Yeah.
If we're talking about a human observer on the surface of the earth, that human observer is going to move with the earth. And so all these passages say the earth is immovable. Well, that's correct if you've got the point of view of the human on the surface of the earth. But one thing I've noticed in my debates with young earth creationists, when it comes to the Genesis chapter 1, they assume that the point of view for the 6 creation days is God above looking down on the earth. Whereas from my perspective, looking at Genesis 1-2, it's God on the surface of the waters looking up at the clouds. And those two differences in point of view make a huge
Yeah.
interpretive impact.
That's right, yes.
I mean, you get a completely different sequence of events in the 6 days of creation if you have the point of view above the clouds as opposed to having the point of view below the clouds. And that's something I spotted the first time I read the Bible at age 17. The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth. Job 38 adds the detail that God had blanketed the seas with clouds that kept the seas dark. Because Genesis 1:2 adds a detail, it's dark on the surface of the waters. The water covers the whole surface of the earth. But if you're interpreting Genesis 1 from the perspective of an observer, God the observer on the surface of the earth looking up at the clouds, you now get a perfect fit with the established scientific record for the description of the events of Earth's history and of Earth's life and the chronological order. But if you have it up above the clouds, then it's a total mismatch with the established scientific record, which is why you have atheist scientists saying Genesis is scientific nonsense. It is if you get the wrong point of view.
Yes. Evan, you want to add anything?
Yeah, so I don't have any science. I'm an engineer. I just read whatever Institute for Creation Research said. So Dr. Ross is probably right. But as engineers, we look at models a lot and things that we can design, make, we can measure, and we can test those models to know if they're good or not. And if they're not good, we go back and tweak it. And I think the biggest challenge with young Earth creationism is that we see a lot of data for an old Earth, as we've already said. But is there a way that you can create a model that fits a literal 24-hour day and have a bunch of old data for an old Earth and universe? I think it's possible. I haven't talked to Pat about this one. So this is like a huge brainstorm session with all of you. So the idea is in calculus, we have two different options, I think. You have a step function like a staircase. You're going straight, and then you go up, and you go straight again. Or the next option is, because the universe is expanding, we can treat it like a dynamic model or a dynamic system. It's expanding, it has acceleration, has a velocity. We know, we can all agree it's expanding. So if I treat it as a dynamical system, we know how to model that as engineers using what's called a first order ordinary differential equation. And if you want to know what that looks like, it's kind of like a step response. It's like you have a ceiling fan, you pull it, and wants to go at the maximum speed. You have to watch and wait for a little bit. After a while, it will reach its maximum speed. So that seems to be possible. I don't know if we can maybe look at that later. Or if it's more of an impulse, that would be a second order ordinary differential equation. You get a huge amount of something, like the universe just warps in, kind of like in Star Wars or Star Trek. You get a spaceship that just comes out of nowhere, comes out of light speed, comes out of warp speed, it just shows up instantaneously. So you get a huge amount of something in a short amount of time. You get a big impulse. So as engineers, we see these kind of models all the time. Is it possible that using that gives you an old Earth, because then everything looks mature? I don't know. But if you looked at Adam when he was created, you would think he's 20 or 30 years old maybe, because he's a man, he's not a boy. You wouldn't assume he's just one day old or a baby, because he's a mature man, he's complete. Is it possible you can copy-paste that to the universe, say it's mature, complete, big? I don't know. But I think mathematically the concepts are possible.
They're possible, but observationally they're not possible. In the sense that if God actually did that, we astronomers would be able to see the record of what he had done. So we don't see any impulse coming in to the universe. What we do see, and you're raising an interesting question that was the core of young Earth creationism 150 years ago. This idea that, yes, the universe looks old, but it's because God made it to look old, when in fact it's less than 10,000 years old. And the example you gave of Adam, when God created him, he was full size. But it tells us repeatedly in the Bible that it's impossible for God to lie or deceive. And the height of Adam would not be an indicator of his age, because unlike the rest of us, he didn't come from the womb of a woman. So God could have made him brand new, 6 feet tall. And so I've argued that because of what the Bible says, that God can't lie or deceive, if a scientist, a medical scientist, was there the moment Adam was born, or created by God, there'd be no gray hair. He'd have a full head of hair.
What? Hey, now that's going too far.
There'd be no chipped teeth, no scar tissue, and that his cholesterol level would be 60 milligrams per liter, not 120, because that's what happens when you age. In fact, that happens quite quickly when you get into your teenage years. And we look at the universe, it's not that it all appears old. What we see and look at the universe, some bodies measure to be very young, some measure to be brand new, and others measure to be thousands of years old, others measure to be millions and billions of years old. We see a complete range of ages. And so, for example, we see stars that have completely consumed all their nuclear fuel, and they're white dwarfs. And a white dwarf star is like a log on a fire that's consumed its fuel. When it's consumed its fuel, it starts off a bright orange color, then it goes red, then it goes deep red, and eventually it becomes a black coal where you can actually touch it and it's completely burnt out. One reason why this debate over whether or not the universe was trillions of years old or quadrillions of years old and billions of years old is if it was quadrillions of years old, we'd see the universe filled with black dwarf stars. We don't see any black dwarf stars at all. The universe is way too young for there to be any completely burnt out stars. Lots of white dwarfs. When we look at the white dwarfs, we see that they have all different stages of cooling. Some have just started to cool, and some have been cooling for billions of years, and then we see a complete range in between. So I think that's evidence that God is not creating with the appearance of age, the fact that we're seeing a full range of ages at objects in the universe that range from 0 all the way to 13.79 billion years.
Yes, we're going to take this time now. James has got the roving mic. I'm sure some of you have got some questions out there for our panelists. So let's go right away. And if you got a question for one of these guys, raise your hand, and James will bring the mic to you.
Are there any UFOs possibly out there or aliens? Is that typical?
Yes, one of the 23 books I've written is Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. And I was an amateur astronomer before I became a professional astronomer. And that's quite rare amongst professional astronomers. So every institution I served at, they said, you get to handle the UFO reports. So unwillingly, I wound up becoming an expert on UFOs. But what I've written in Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, one thing we know for sure, it's not beings like us coming to us from another planetary system. Why? Because that would violate the laws of physics. We're just talking, the laws of physics haven't changed. Those laws of physics are going to apply to aliens just as much as they apply to us. And when you travel through interstellar space, space is not empty. It's filled with particles. And if you're moving, say, at 1/10 the velocity of light, E equals mc squared, you get a lot of damage on your spaceship. And so this has actually been taken into account because astronomers now want to actually send spaceships to the nearest planet outside of our solar system. That would be the planet orbiting Alpha Centauri, 4.25 light years away. But they recognize that it's not going to be possible to send a big spaceship there, because if you move it at 1/10 the velocity of light or 2/10 the velocity of light, it'll be completely destroyed by the particles. So the plan is we're going to send 1,000 spaceships to that nearest planet outside of our solar system, but the spaceships are all going to be smaller than 10 centimeters across. If they're smaller than 10 centimeters across, there's a possibility that some of those spaceships will only be partly damaged and still be able to send back some useful information. The anticipation is, well, 600 of them will be destroyed. The other 400 will be damaged, but they'll be damaged in different ways, and we'll get back some useful information. But what that tells us, you're not going to send a being as big as us. In fact, you can't even send a termite. A termite's not going to make it in a spaceship that small. Now, There is a way you could actually traverse interstellar space and keep beings the size of us alive, but you would need a spaceship as large as our moon, because now you can provide adequate protection. But now you've got the challenge. How do you move something as big as the moon across interstellar space at a high velocity where the spaceship itself remains intact enough that beings on board? Bottom line is, we're not being invaded by physical beings like us.
Good
On the other hand, what we're noticing with the UFOs, there's over 2,000 documented cases where multiple observers actually see the UFO going through the atmosphere, which means we can track its path and its velocity. And the velocities run from 5,000 to 15,000 miles per hour. But the observers always report no sonic booms and no heat friction. Now, I've seen the space shuttle go through the atmosphere. You get this long streak of heat and light behind it because of the friction when it engages the atmosphere. And you hear two loud sonic booms. UFOs, never been a sonic boom, never been the observation of heat friction. And in 2,000 cases where they have this kind of data, where they actually see the UFO crash into the ground, you go to the crash site, there's a crater. If there's snow, the snow is melted. The vegetation is damaged. But when you go to the crater site, there's no debris, there's no artifacts. If we're dealing with something that was physical, there'd be artifacts. On the other hand, the fact that you see a crater, melted snow, damaged vegetation, tells you something real caused that. This is not just a delusion. We're dealing with non-physical reality. And one of the professors I had at the University of Toronto was Carl Sagan, and we had a discussion about UFOs. And he said, they just don't exist at all. But here's the difference. His worldview did not tolerate the possibility of non-physical reality. As a Christian, my worldview does. I mean, God has created realms outside of this universe. Angels dwell in a realm very different than ours. And so, and by the way, I'm not the only physicist who's written on this subject. 6 physicists have spent more than a decade studying the UFO phenomena. I'm the only one that's a Christian. The other 6 are not. But what's interesting, they all agree with me, we're dealing with a transdimensional or interdimensional phenomena. Jacques Vallée, the French astrophysicist who's put the most time into this research, says we're dealing with interdimensional beings. Well, the Bible talks about interdimensional beings. They're angels. The other thing we notice about these UFO phenomena, the only people that have the real encounters, I say that because 99% of what people reported to me as UFOs, I can explain as a natural phenomena, a hoax, or military activity that's being kept secret. But there's 1%, and that 1% falls in this category of non-physical reality. But the only people that have these encounters are those with open doors to the occult.
That's exactly
You close the doors of the occult, that's the end of your UFO experiences. And so we argue that ours is a scientifically testable model. Open up doors to the demonic activity and the occult. Don't be surprised if you're having these close encounters with UFOs.
exactly
Close all the doors, that'll be the end of your UFO encounters. It also explains why so many more people in France are having these encounters than people in the US. The level of occult activity is an order of magnitude greater in France than it is here in the US. It also explains why when I went to the Soviet Union in the 1980s to speak, there was a huge number, large percentage of the population were having these UFO encounters. But there was also a time when the Soviet Union was sponsoring research on occult physics. Now that they're not, the level of UFO experiences has exponentially dropped. There's a direct correlation.
Amen.
Richard, you had you
Well,
studied the
you know,
occult there?
I find this very interesting. Outside my formal studies in philosophy, the area that I've spent the most time studying is the occult. And you can even build the argument, I'm sure Hugh could do this, you can build the argument even stronger, because if you look at the worldview that people begin to embrace, in their encounter with these extraterrestrials, it's basically the worldview of the occult. So in the 19th century, these experiences would be characterized in these religious categories. Hey, an angel came to me and took me to heaven or whatever. In the 20th and 21st century, an extraterrestrial came to me and took me to his UFO. But if you read the conclusions that these experiences lead the recipients to come to about the nature of reality, it's very, very similar. And you can show biblically that it's the same message, the same lie that Satan gave Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You don't really die, which is either you're dead, and the biblical doctrine of death is Hebrews 9:27. It is appointed unto man to die once, and after this the judgment. In the occult, you'll see, well, you just die once, but there's no judgment. That would be like Satanism. Or others would say, no, you die over and over again. And so you get which is reincarnation. And you get both of those messages out of these occult encounters. So, and of course, Jacques Vallée gives a lot of credence to it as someone who's not really trying to prove a Christian point. By the way, the character in Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind is loosely based on Lacombe, the character in there, the French scientist, is loosely based on Jacques Vallée. You get a picture of Jacques Vallée and his attaché, and then the clip from the movie, and they look exactly alike. So that was deliberate. But I think Hugh's exactly right, that these things are more easily explained as probably demonic activities rather than actually literal physical extraterrestrials.
I would like to give a word of affirmation to Evan, because what I see Evan doing is what we're all supposed to do, which is to test for truth. And Evan, I love the fact that you've been taught engineering, you've been taught a significant body of information from the Institute for Creation Research, and you're taking your knowledge from engineering to try to build a model that works. And honestly, model building is partly how Hugh, I'm his wife, so I can say this, right? Okay.
Not Evan's wife, you're Hugh's
yeah, not
wife.
Evan's wife, yeah. I'm way too old to be Evan's grandmother, but anyway. Yeah, just building models is how scientists test for truth. So I love the fact that you have commented on how you are exploring ways to use what you've learned from your engineering training to build a viable model that fits. To me, that deserves an applause, and I want to say
Thank you.
Yeah, good man.
I have a question. I actually sent several to the app in the book, but anyway, so I guess this pertains to young earthers. So there's biblical figures that have lived in the Bible, like say for 500 years, over 1,000 years. So
Not
say,
over 1,000.
yeah.
None of them over 1,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, Methuselah
okay.
was, yeah.
So anyway, so then how does that affect the young earthers' point of view? Because then you have all these people living for, I don't know, like in sequence,
yeah.
and they make up like a couple thousand years or whatever it is. All of a sudden, like Christ was born over 2,000 years ago. How do you,
Yeah, this is a good question. You know, there's nothing in the scriptures that say all of these people lived that long. There's basically 10 of the patriarchs whose life expanse is amazingly long. So without further argument, one couldn't conclude that everybody lived to be these old ages. We just know of these 10 specifically. And it's interesting that Abraham, who's not that far removed from some of these patriarchs chronologically, was amazed that he could have a child at 100 years old. When you would go, well, if everybody was living to be 700 to 800 years old and they're all having children, why would Abraham all of a sudden be startled when God says, you're going to have a child? And he's like, I'm 100 years old. How am I going to have a child? So that, to me, seems to be an indication that even Abraham understood that these long lifespans, taking them at just prima facie to be exactly what they are, what they seem to be rather, was unusual or was more the exception than the general rule. And so whatever that exception is, I'm not sure. I'd have to kind of process it a while, but I think it's the mistaken assumption that many people have made is because the Bible lists these particular people living so long, that's just the way everybody was. I mean, there were models built on that before the flood. There was less radiation in people, and then at the flood. I'm not sure that works. But at any rate, I think it's only just those ones that are listed that actually lived that long.
Can I interject here?
No.
But you're asking how is it, if you put them all together, how does that account for the 6,000 to 10,000 years? That's what you're asking, right?
Yeah. I mean, the one that lived the oldest died before the flood.
That's correct. Yeah.
So Methuselah lived 969 years.
If you look in Genesis right after Noah, you'll see there's a verse that talks about how God limited mankind's age to about 120 years. It's in there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, James, so since we're running out of time, let me come to the last question here. You know, Richard or Hugh, I forgot who stated it, but you said that this debate has been going on for centuries, and the dialogue has been quite cordial until, what, the last century?
Right.
What happened here to make the dialogue go this route?
Charles Darwin. I mean, the debate did not become acrimonious until people were saying, hey, looks like evolution explains the whole history of life. We don't need God to be involved. Natural selection, mutations, gene exchange explains it all. And of course, that goes completely counter to what the Bible tells us, that God is the author of all life. He's the creator of life. And so naturally, there was a strong reaction. The problem was you had some Christians saying, the way we're going to close the door, we're just not going to give the scientists the time they need to make these models work. But you know, when I was reading the astronomical literature during my teenage years, what I saw was a universal consensus. If it's billions of years, there's no way we can save Charles Darwin. We need way more time than that, at least 1,000 times as much time. It's the biologists that had the delusion that they could make it work in billions of years. The physicists and the astronomers that are actually working with real numbers, you know, let's actually put the numbers into the equations and see what we can get, they quickly recognize this isn't going to happen. To give you one example, Britain's most famous mathematical physicist of the early 20th century was Sir Arthur Eddington. And he was a bitter opponent to Big Bang cosmology. And he wrote, hey, the Big Bang is philosophically repugnant. It just doesn't give us enough time to make evolution work. Therefore, we've got to throw it out. But what happened in the latter part of the 20th century, observational measurements by astronomers said, it's Big Bang. It's not steady state. There really is a beginning to the universe. And you made a comment earlier about how before Big Bang cosmology, there was this perception the universe was infinitely old. That was because of Isaac Newton. Interestingly, Isaac Newton was a devout Christian. But after his death, people kind of looked at his Newtonian mechanics and saying, if this explains all the mechanics of the universe must be billions of years old. On the other hand, in the latter part of the 19th century, they said, we must be missing something. It can't just be Newtonian mechanics because we're seeing things that don't quite fit, particularly the orbit of Mercury. That was recognized even in 1850, that we got a problem with Mercury that Newton can't explain. And you know, that's kind of how science works. We see these little tiny discrepancies in our understanding, the models we're talking about. You look at those little anomalies and you say, are we missing something? That's how general relativity was discovered. Hey, when we put general relativity in, it fixed the problem of Newtonian mechanics. And I've been on record saying we may be adjusting general relativity. We know it explains the dynamics of the universe at the 20 places of the decimal, but we haven't gotten to the 40th decimal place yet. When we go that far out, we might discover we need to make a tiny adjustment to general relativity. So, and the physicists always understood that. The Christians during the 19th century said, okay, you know, if Newton explains everything, we got a problem with the Bible, and we don't think that's possible. We must be missing something.
Yeah, so Richard, we're going to have you close us off here.
All right.
So summarize with us what the two positions have in common, what they share, and do you see a day when you see the two sides coming together? You know, I've been at a lot of conferences where it can be pretty heated, and people in the audience leave crying in tears, you know. But do you see a day when these two viewpoints will be coming together?
Yeah, let me take them in reverse order.
Yeah.
What I would consider to be satisfactory coming together is coming together in the sense that we can have these dialogues without dividing over them. Not coming together in the sense that one side's going to win the debate. I don't have that hope even for the Calvinists and Arminians, okay? And they've been at it maybe longer than the old earth and young earth have been at it. So in other words, it doesn't matter to me sometimes that these things are ultimately settled to everybody's satisfaction. But at least pending that ultimate settling it to everyone's satisfaction, that we can sustain our differences in the context of Christian love. So that, I would be happy to see that day. I think it's possible to do. I know that there's a growing number of young earth creationists who are trying to make that happen, even before they make the advances in the debate itself. They're trying to make advances in the way in which the debate is conducted. We've tried to do that at Southern Evangelical Seminary by having both old and young earth creationists who are scientists, biologists, and geologists, and astronomers come and give presentations. As far as the first question, I think Hugh's already outlined some of the things that we share in common. We are in solidarity against the theistic evolution. We're in solidarity in terms of the historicity of the days of Genesis and Adam and Eve. Norm Geisler, who formulated our doctoral statement, is our co-founder at Southern Evangelical Seminary. And so, because if you ask Dr. Geisler, well, how do you regard the days of or the young earth, old earth debate? He said, well, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm young earth, and Tuesday, Thursday, I'm old. You know, he would, in other words, to him, it was something that was not a hill he was wanting to die on. He was let others carry that debate. So in the interest of sending a signal to the readers on our doctoral statement that we were open to both camps, he worded it that our doctoral statement was the 6 historic days of Genesis. Well, that wasn't enough because so many people took that to mean, oh, you mean literal 24 hours? No, it can be historic even if it's a long period of time. In fact, it's no less historic if it's a long period of time than if it's 24 hours. So both the young earth and old earth regard these days as historic. We regard Adam and Eve as historic and not mythologies. So those are the things. And of course, from that, you can begin to satisfy to yourself the fealty that both camps have to the gospel. That is to say, people like Hugh and Fuzz Rana and the other team at RTB and other people at the Discovery Institute, at least the Christians that are there, because it's not exclusively a Christian organization, are committed to the deity of Christ, the supremacy of the gospel, and these kind of things. So that's, of course, that's our main thing there, and we are in solidarity in that regard.
All right. Hey, let's hear it for our panel here. A great discussion.
All right, we're going to excuse Dr. Zucker and Dr. Kawamura to go ahead and get ready to head out to their sessions. Again, a reminder, if you're going to Dr. Zuckeran's session, you're going to go down this walkway here, up the stairs on the right, and it's in the youth room. If you are going to Dr. Cuevas's seminar, he is down the hall, make a right turn before the stairs, and it's in classroom 2. And if you're staying for Dr. Kawamura's session, it's right here. You're in the right place. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then just so you know what time we're going to finish up, I'm planning to go around and ring a bell or shout when it's time to come back. We're planning to start the next session in here at 3:30. So around 3:25 or so, you'll hear me with like a chicken without its head. Ah, time to get back. That kind of thing. All right. So go ahead. We'll see you in your workshops in 5 minutes. Thank you.